Welcome to today's podcast. We're going to be doing part 2 on the safe use of AI in clinical practice. And as everyone's aware, there's an awful lot of chatter, particularly in primary care, about AI and how it can really help relieve some of the pressure in the system, which is desperately needed. But how safe is it, and where are the fishhooks? Is privacy actually an issue? In this episode, we are going to look at generative AI as opposed to the summarising AI programs that we talked about in part 1, and we'll look at it through a medico-legal lens. My name is Dr. Sam King. I'm a medico-legal consultant with Medical Protection, and I'm also a GP. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Mr. Joe Fitzgerald, who's a partner at Watt & Carney, our panel law firm. Joe specialises in cybersecurity and privacy, and he's provided many of our MPS members with invaluable legal help when it comes to cyber attack and other gnarly privacy issues. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
And I'd like to welcome back Dr. Carl Cole, who is a GP in South Auckland. He is also specialises in information systems and communication, and he's done a lot in this area, and he's an early adopter of things AI. So glad to have you back with us too, Carl.
Kia ora, thank you.
And Lucy Gibbard, my colleague at Medical Protection, is joining us. She is a GP in Taranaki. Welcome back, Lucy.
Thanks, Sam.
So last time we did talk about summarising AI, which most people are using. It would be Nabla Copilot. And I really want to shift focus now and talk about those larger, broader AI programs that are out there. So let's start with some, I guess, relatively small things in terms of member contact that I'm aware of. So we had an inquiry recently at MPS where a practice asked if it was okay to use ChatGPT to draft a response to a complaint. In fact, some of our colleagues suspect that this is already being used, judging by a few of the drafts that we've seen. We've seen similar wording, which sounded a little bit unusual to us. And in fact, I've had one member recently tell me she openly admitted that she'd used ChatGPT to provide the response because she didn't have time to write it herself, and she sent that to me, which I have to say required quite a lot of editing. Carl, as an owner of a clinical practice, can you see a use for this?
I'd see the use for this in anything but to do with writing clinical notes or involving putting in clinical data, but having to do lots of other compliance type of writing and templates for things, I see great use for it because I didn't get into med school because of my England skills. Writing nice and well-written letters why someone should be off in jury duty and having those templates or templates maybe for to get people to come back and recalls. We tend to have not the best writers in our staff, and I'm one of the worst of them. So it's a great it's a fancy grammar checker if you got generic templates. So I find that's where it's great. For helping me in practice. But as I say, I wouldn't go near it for any kind of clinical documentation involving patient notes.
Okay, so if we consider two scenarios. In the first scenario, there's a complaint about the cost of an appointment and the reception was allegedly rude to the patient. And so the doctor wants to draft a response to that and wants to use ChatGPT. Joe, what are your thoughts around that? Can we safely use ChatGPT in this sort of scenario?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. It's a tricky one. You'd have to be so careful. There's an input problem and an output problem. We can't put any personal information or health information into these programs because we don't know where it goes. We don't know what it's used for. Presumably it's used to train the model, at which points, all bets are off. That is to say, the information that ChatGPT is submitted to it is then used to make ChatGPT better. And we don't have the appropriate consents or purposes for using personal information we gather in our day-to-day work for that kind of thing. So as Carl's alluded to there, we have to be really, really careful about what goes in. If it's a case of producing generic language using a prompt that doesn't actually give away any personal health information, that's one thing, but hard to do, hard to ensure that you're not actually using any personal health information if you're asking it to do a specific thing. And then I suppose the second thing is that the output, we've got no guarantee around the quality of the output here. Obviously you'll check it. You're not just going to say, ChatGPT, please send that to whoever it needs to go to. But you are responsible for the accuracy of that communication as well. So it's not to say don't ever go near it ever. That's not realistic, but you need to be very careful about what goes into it and very careful about what comes out.
So let's think of a slightly different scenario. Let's just say the patient has complained about the clinical care that two of the doctors have provided. They've had let's just say a delayed diagnosis of cancer, and they were complaining that the doctors didn't treat them appropriately or take them seriously, and et cetera, et cetera. Do you think there's a difference in terms of using ChatGPT in that kind of scenario, Joe?
I think, if anything, for me, it becomes a little bit more acute. You're talking about something which is relatively serious, particularly if it's an allegation concerning someone's health and the fact that something quite serious has been missed. I mean, there's going to be a range of relatively sensitive information. We know that health information is inherently sensitive. That's what our regulator tells us. And two, if you're drafting a response like that, it's relatively serious allegations that have been made. It's complicated legal and other obligations that you're having to consider, and you simply have no idea where ChatGPT is drawing the basis on which it's preparing that response for you. I mean, we know that these models they're large language models. We talked about these in the previous podcast. They are fed and built through applying them with masses of data, and they draw connections, and they're effectively able to say, well, based on all these millions of connections previously, I can tell that this is probably what you want. But you've got no way of verifying whether that's the right approach or not. So for something like that, where, highly likely that there's going to be quite sensitive information involved, and also the need to get that right. I mean, it's quite different from the example you use, Carl, isn't it, of something which is quite generic, and really it's just a case of finding the right words to describe something relatively straightforward. Something like that is probably not a situation in which you want to lean on ChatGPT, even as a base, right? It's going to set you off on the wrong track, I think.
I often think about it as also that right to be treated with respect, and how would a patient feel if they found out that, and could they find out? I mean, if a patient asks you, did you use ChatGPT to write this? You'd have to be honest, wouldn't you? And would you end up being, considered that that's not treating your patients with respect, or not upholding their right to complain and have their complaint taken seriously if you're just sending it to ChatGPT to
I think if it depends what it produced and you edit it. I think if you're responsible for what got out, and I think these two scenarios here, these people clearly don't read it. My wife's a professor at Auckland University, and students are doing this, and clearly they don't read it because it produces, sure, I'll do that for you, and then it produces what it says, and they've copied and pasted that into the response, so it's clearly come from ChatGPT. So yeah, that's lazy,
disrespectful,
not paying attention, versus it can vastly improve, and it is accurate and it's factual, and it did say what you want to say. So sometimes it gives you the word. So I've been using it not for any patient complaints, but other communications, is it just changed the tone, or and I was playing around with explain how this all works, and it was really complicated. Then a large language model, so explain this to a 5-year-old, and it was, doctors have got a cool new thing that makes it easier to make notes. Oh yeah, that's okay. So it's quite good for some of that times when I'm trying to in other scenarios.
I think for that situation where it's a clinical complaint with clinical, I think you've got to be a little bit careful, because I do wonder if patients are going to start saying, and the doctor seemed to have used ChatGPT to respond, and goes to the health HDC saying, I think they used ChatGPT, and I can't see that that's going to be looked at very kindly.
The use case for it in that scenario is so specific to the point where you sort of wonder, is it worth it? Yeah. Was it worth it? Lucy, you raise a very good point around sort of respect and dealing with complaints appropriately, right? There's this overarching question of whether that's actually the appropriate thing to do.
I think one of the other questions that was raised, amongst our team at MPS was consent. Do we need patient consent to use any AI tool in order to respond?
That's the kind of question, isn't it, really? It's absolutely critical. We have obligations under both the Privacy Act and the Health Information Privacy Code to provide people with notice regarding what you're going to do with their information, who you're going to disclose it to, what those purposes might be, what it might get used for. If you are putting personal information or health information into something like ChatGPT, which really is, for a service like that that's connected to the internet, tumbling it into the great unknown, you lose control over what it's going to be used for. It's presumably consistent in the very first instance with the purposes for which you gathered it, because you are putting it in there to pursue some kind of clinical goal. There's an aim here. I'm doing this for a reason. I'm not doing this for fun. But then at that point, you've disclosed it to a third-party entity and you have no idea what they may use it for. So, yeah, absolutely critical. I mean, it's not really just these AI applications. It's any case where we are disclosing information to a third party who may use it in a way which is inconsistent with what we're using it for. But the likes of ChatGPT is a great example of an entirely opaque system, right? We've got no idea. So yeah, absolutely. We should be making sure that we're very clear with people what we're doing with particularly their health information, and that we're giving them a chance to say to us, I'm not very happy about that. I'd rather you didn't.
Even if you don't say there, if there's no patient identifying details, no address, no name, no nothing, is that still not allowed? So if you're describing somebody's clinical situation but there's nothing identifiable.
There's an interesting scenario. It's a very interesting parallel with messaging in clinical PAS systems, be it patient information systems or EHRs. So if I'm saying to Joe, hey, what do you do with heavy menstrual bleeding now? Do you go straight to taking the pill? It's in pathways. That's a conversation with us discussing a scenario that I thought Sam told me that something changed and I'm updating.
Yeah.
And it's about a patient, but it's a case and a scenario or symptom set. But if I sort of said, what about these blood results? And I copied it into those messenger. That's clinical data. I've then taken outside of a clinical record and in between messaging. And what if I put a picture of someone in an email that's not encrypted and it goes and that can get forwarded? So does everything have to be in a enclosed, double-factor, encrypted messaging inside an EHR or patient information system? It's a funny border sometimes, and it can slowly slip to.
It's an excellent point, Carl. You've hit it on the head there, and I think the thing is, at what point does it stop being information about someone? Like, at what point is someone no longer identifiable, right? And then we're not actually talking about their personal information, their health information. You're talking about a generic query. Draft me a template for responding to a complaint regarding a patient who has complained about fees charged. Yeah. It doesn't actually tell us anything about the person, does it? It's pretty generic, and actually, I think you'd have a relatively strong argument there that the regulation around it just isn't actually engaged. What I would note is that the thing you've just described is a concept called pseudonymization, providing pseudonyms for people, and it's something that other jurisdictions deal with quite extensively, and our legislation has just stepped away from and gone, whoa, no thank you. Really difficult, because re-identifying people is something that numerous studies show is really, really easy to do. So you just need to be very careful when, it's another thing to keep in mind, right? When you are disclosing information and you're doing it on the basis that actually I've stripped out everything that could really identify this person, so it's actually quite a generic query. Just be very comfortable with the fact that you have stripped out anything that could identify this person. You find, person of this age, of this ethnicity, with this condition, living in this area of New Zealand, suddenly you are talking about a very small group of people, right? So tricky one to balance, and I think it's why it's so important that you're just really, really clear before you do disclose to third parties.
I think for the more clinical detail that you have, it is easier to identify that person. And not only that, but it only takes one slip. It's like when people try to anonymise their notes when they send them to MPS, as some of our members do, and they only need to miss out one little NHI number and you've missed it completely. And I wonder about that with ChatGPT. And so what I'm hearing, Joe, is that you need to consider consent if you're going to use it, but no patient is going to consent to you using ChatGPT to respond to a complaint, I don't think.
No, and by the time you've asked them, you've probably caused some further problems already.
Yes, so maybe you could use ChatGPT for anonymised, very low level, non-clinical complaints or matters. Would that be right?
I think preparing correspondence at a high level, I can't see any issue with that. It's when it starts getting specific to the point where it's clear who the individual is involved, or you're able to identify them. Because at that point, you are providing them with personal health information.
Okay. No, so that's
and
great.
this is where it's going to get very interesting very fast with Microsoft bringing out their Copilot. I've used the latest Outlook, and it's suggesting responses which are very specific to your email. And it's just beginning. And I don't know where I signed that consent that they're allowed to look through my emails and suggest a response.
Wow. Let's now look at a slightly different area, and I'm sure in both primary and secondary care, inbox management is a huge issue. And in the ideal world, AI would summarise discharge letters for everybody or write them, update the medication and problem lists, they would review blood tests, notify patients, set recalls, and the rest of it. And I am aware that there is some work being done to use AI to file some inbox documents. And I think it's more of the one that I'm aware of, they use automation, and as opposed to the broader AI programs. So they look for keywords and they file normal reports. Are you, Lucy or Carl, aware of any other projects going on that in fact are using the more generative or the more broad AI programs?
Well, I don't know, Procare's led the way on a robot. Now, that's sort of term that's been replaced by AI. I think the simplest way to look at that is programming that people are most familiar with is the sort of if-then scenario. If creating normal file it, and they can run those robots on all sorts of software for a long time. If this and it looks at certain parts of a PDF, for example, do this. Then you get an output from the spreadsheet. It processed 80 forms. These ones it couldn't understand, but these ones it's done this to. So it's a very, what people would kind of understand, if-then algorithm that you can understand where it's gone wrong because it couldn't see that. Then there's the AI concept, which is trained by an input, keeps making a lot of mistakes, and it goes, yes, that's right. And then that pathway gets accepted and learnt by it, and it's learning. And we're not sure how that causes it to keep learning. So you don't know how those if-thens are working between that input because that output. That AI isn't being used by anyone I know of, but it's been highly proposed, postulated all over the place, and I'm super careful about that. My only real experience is stuffing up my 16-year-old's robotic competition when we had a left and right trained robot based on arrows, and at the last minute realised it had to be able to go ahead at the same time. So we quickly made a sign for go ahead, did that, trained it to go ahead, that's good, no good, trained it. It stuffed up the left and right because by adding new inputs, it had new pathways inside the programming layers. So that's the sort of distinction difference between that kind of project, which is robots, very, very if-then, versus this, we don't know how it's learning, and then suddenly you chuck in new inputs, and it's totally relearned stuff, and the stuff you would get an output from, it's now changed what it's doing. And I think that needs to be regulated. I would not go near there, because that's the problem. You just got no idea how it's been done, and the output's not being checked by someone.
And not necessarily predictable.
And not predictable, because someone else has been training over here and is affecting the model, yeah.
So what you're talking about, Carl, it sounds like we should be very wary of it. When I heard about the automation, it sounded great. They were doing a pilot to file these specific, only one specific type of result.
My first question is, what type of automation? How's the automation happening? So if it's the more rules-based and you can see it and you get the output and what it failed on, yeah, that's easy to control. Automatic automation that you don't know how it worked and how it made its decisions, so you don't see what it's done. How is that? Yeah, so that's two different types of automation.
So automation is all right, but using AI
automation on these engines, we've got no experience in how they work, and they can be changed so quickly. Yeah, no.
Okay, I don't. Well, I am aware, though, that they were piloting this. They audited every report, and it got 100%. I don't know whether they're using it more generally now. But I'd heard about this, I think, earlier this year. Joe, I'd like to just ask you, what are your views on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So one of the points we talked about in the previous podcast was kind of this continuum of AI, right? There's different technologies which fit under this umbrella. The OPC, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, has identified sort of 5 technologies they're interested in, and automation is one of them. And when we're talking about automation, we're really talking about using computers to do things that people used to do, right? We're moving labour from one place to another. That's effectively what's happening here. In terms of legal risks, I'd say it's relatively low. It depends how you implement it. I mean, we've talked before about disclosure, where's the information going, these sorts of things. But if we're talking about a tool which is largely locally operating, it's filing things or reviewing reports or checking things, summarizing things, and that was a job that was previously done by an individual, it's certainly not the kind of high risk AI software that we've perhaps been talking about in other areas. I mean, Carl makes a very good point about one, how these decisions are being made, and 2, the accuracy of it all. And that's something that we've talked about before. But the key concern here really is how are you ensuring accuracy of that processing? Because it's a bit of a disaster, isn't it? If it goes not rogue, we don't want to talk about rogue in the concept of AI, but, what if it's filing things incorrectly? What does that mean for your patients? What are you doing to check? Is there a human involved in that process, and how do you verify it? It sort of takes away from the advantage of the whole thing if then someone's going through and being like, yes, checking every little thing. So really for us, I think in terms of issues for things like automation, it's balancing it, right? What are the advantages to be had? How do we make sure that it's as accurate as possible? And then what kind of checking are we doing just to make sure it hasn't gone rogue? Sorry, Lucy, I cut you off there.
No, I was just thinking it really depends on you getting your rules right, doesn't it?
Yes.
Because it's all very well, you really don't want to tell your computer to file all your normal results, because there are some normal results that, although they're normal from the lab reference, they may not be normal for that patient, or that, so I think it's being aware of when we are using our intelligence to look at a normal result and realise it's not normal, and so making sure your rules are right. Because I think that if your rules are right and you're saying, well, I'm happy for you to file a normal creatinine, but I'm not happy for you to file a normal PSA, and I'm not happy for you to file a normal CRP, because sometimes that's what jogs me to reduce their prednisone if they've got polymyalgia. That totally. there are some normals that we have to be aware that we're using our brain for, and some normals that we're not.
Very simple and build up. So you could file that normal creatinine if it's no different than 5 from the last one.
Yeah.
That kind of, and you can get more sophisticated, so you've got more safety nets. And what we all know for inbox management at the moment, you can file a lot of stuff that we know isn't actually needed. It's not meant to go past us. They're just using the inbox as a way to get it into the notes. So it's a copy to. And our inboxes don't have that capacity. But that's interpreting from the notes. Is this a copy to, or is this something for us to... so that's a really hard thing to do.
I think it's an interesting area, and I suspect there's a lot of work being put into it, because the inbox issue is widespread. So I think it's watch this space. Let's now turn to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and if we look at the information privacy principles or rules under the Health Information Privacy Code, if we think about, let's start with Privacy Principle 5, it's about the storage and security of information, and that states that an agency that holds personal information must ensure that the information is protected by such security safeguards as are reasonable in the circumstances against loss, access, use and misuse. And that if necessary for the information to be given to a person in connection with the provision of the service to the agency, everything reasonably within the power of the agency is done to prevent unauthorised use or unauthorised disclosure of the information. So, Joe, regarding the broader AI tools, like, for example, ChatGPT, can you explain what would be considered reasonable in these circumstances?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's fantastically vague, lawyerly wording, isn't it? It's pitched that way intentionally. The reason it's pitched that way intentionally is that this legislation has to apply to a range of sectors, right? So we know health information is deemed to be inherently sensitive. What that means is the standard of security that should be applied to it is inherently high. What that means from month to month, year to year is going to change because security changes, threats to securities change. We know the Office of the Privacy Commissioner has drawn one low watermark, which is multi-factor authentication. Talk to your IT people. They'll be able to talk you through that. But basically ensuring that accounts and systems are secured using something more than just a password. Is it an app on your phone? Do you get a text with a code in it? These sorts of things. But in terms of what other security needs to be in place, it is a moving feast. CERT has some really great recommendations. That when I say CERT, our Computer Emergency Response Team, you can Google them. They are the arm of the government who's in charge of, I suppose, the government's public-facing cybercrime and cybersecurity functionality. They have some really fantastic recommendations. I think their list of essential controls is up to 10 now. I might be incorrect about that. But it's really a case of ensuring that you are taking appropriate responsibility, and in this case, the responsibility is high. You don't have to be Fort Knox. A 5-person GP practice somewhere in the country is not the FBI. You don't need to have, absolutely ironclad, but you do need to have turned your mind to it and consider it very closely. The second part of this requirement is it's all well and good for your systems to be nice and secure, but whenever you're disclosing information to a third party, you need to take reasonable steps to ensure that their security is also up to scratch. So really that's a case of, the third party vendors that you engage with where you are actually disclosing information to them. And if you are using an AI tool that does involve the disclosure of information, ChatGPT is a great example. It goes into the great unknown. What are the security controls in place? Are they consummate with your own? Are they applying the same kind of standards? That's normally set out in contractual documentation, right? Again, I'm a lawyer. Everyone else here is doctors. We're not necessarily IT security experts, but you need to make sure that the people who are looking after your security or do have knowledge in this area are comfortable that the same levels are being reached. So it's as I say, it's two things. It's about your security. It's about the security of the people you're providing information to.
Great. The principles 6 and 7 relate to access and correction of personal information. So if that information is not held elsewhere by the AI people, if you like, whoever they are, then I'm assuming we're just talking about what's held locally. And I think most clinicians are pretty on to that in terms of security, all of those sorts of things. But when it comes to looking at using AI, what do we need to think about there?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because often the reason we'll be using AI is to something like we've talked about Nebula Copilot extensively that records sessions and creates patient notes. Alternatively, you might be using it as a way to shortcut the creation of template documents or things like that. But really, you're going to be using it in a way that may result in information being kind of misconstrued. There may be errors. There may be things that need to be corrected. So access to information, you're certainly going to need to provide people with access to their clinical notes in the usual way. You're almost certainly going to need to be able to provide people with confirmation of the kinds of tools that you've been using. There's no, in New Zealand, explicit requirement around what we call algorithmic transparency. That does exist in other jurisdictions, and it's basically an explicit requirement to provide people with information about the tools you are using and how they work, which you can only imagine is deeply complicated, right? Like it's not something which is all that practical in practice, but those access requirements when you're using things like AI tools almost certainly expand to a bit of information about what that tool does and how it works and the kind of outputs you get from it. And then, of course, people have a right to correction once you've provided them with access. If you've processed their information before through a tool, they've made an access request, you need to provide information about what was gathered in the first place, what the tool did, and then what the output was. They have the right to require correction of that information, and if you disagree, you have to put a note on the file saying, well, they've asked for correction, but we disagree. So what these AI tools do, what automated processing does in terms of the principles 6 and 7 is really complicate your involvement with it a bit. There's more points where things can be misconstrued, made incorrect, and more points where individuals can ask for correction, and probably more importantly, more information you have to provide them when they make an access request.
Thank you for that. So Principle 8 talks about accuracy of the information. So in my thinking, if you're certain about the accuracy of the information you're putting into whatever program you happen to be using, then would that cover Principle 8? Would that?
There's a bit more to all that, isn't there? So absolutely, you need to be comfortable that the information you're putting into these programs is accurate, but you also need to be comfortable that the output is accurate as well. So that involves ensuring that whenever you have an automated process, there is a human in that link, and that's very clear from the OPC's guidance on the use of AI technologies. And we've spoken before about automation blindness. How do you ensure that people aren't overly reliant on these automated processes, that we're not just looking at the outputs and going, oh yes, fine, without actually checking are those correct. I mean, there's studies to show that as humans we have a tendency to be overly reliant on things that produce automated outputs. So it's going to be an ongoing struggle, isn't it, ensuring that we're able to go through and check those outputs and make sure that they're accurate, particularly as this technology becomes more prevalent.
So Lucy, from a practical perspective for the clinician, is there anything that we can do, on a practical level?
For making sure that what is entered is correct, I think there are things that you can do, and actually having really good systems is probably the start of that, and having good policies, and training your staff properly if you're going to be using something like NABLA Copilot, that everyone understands their requirements to actually review those notes, and potentially having a system where you review them with the patient before they get copied into the notes, and that becomes the accepted process. I mean, in everything in medical protection, we're forever telling people to do audits. The issue with auditing these systems, though, is that it's always hard to know what's not there or what's inaccurate unless you've got something to measure it against. So although auditing's good and you can use it to do review of accuracy to some degree, it's always going to be a little bit challenging for not being able to know what's not there. Equally, many practices now, ours is one where we allow patients access to the notes through the portal. So in those situations, essentially a patient, and I've had that, the patient has messaged me through the portal saying, oh, that's not what we said. And I've, missed out a no or something like that. And that's really helpful that the patients can read their notes, and they are part of that maintaining accuracy. And look, with anything that you're starting, I think you've got to make sure that when you first start using it, that you do review that and evaluate it, and make sure that you are being, particularly at the start of those processes, very robust in your assessment of what's actually being put into the notes.
So there are some practical things that practices do need to look at.
Yes. Just to check on that, Lucio, as I often say to people, you mean you're not 100% perfect? Your notes are wrong sometimes now. And I've reviewed patient notes from hospitals and they're wrong a lot. I mean, serious, a lot. And we all know the classic doctor right thing. If we see 150 patients a week and you're 99% perfect, there's still quite a lot of missed in that. And we're always compromising. So I think there's this kind of like, it's a kind of a lesser of two evils with different problems coming up here.
With Privacy Principle 9, it talks about the retention of health information, and, as clinicians we know we have to keep the notes for 10 years since the last consult. But generally, an organisation shouldn't retain personal information for longer than it is required for the purpose in which you can lawfully use it. But when you put something into an AI program, I'm assuming, Joe, that you lose control over that.
Yeah, you do, right? It depends on the nature of the disclosure and why they're doing it. I mean, in the case of NABLA, for example, when we are using these products, we're actually creating multiple copies of effectively the same thing, right? You've got the audio recording, you've got the raw notes, you've got the notes as transcribed that go into the practice management system. So you really need to be asking yourself, do I actually need to keep copies of each of these? Probably not for the purpose for which they were gathered, which is, providing medical treatment. So query how long you should be keeping things like the audio recording, like the raw transcription, and then the patient note. Carl, it sounds like in the case of NABLA Copilot, they don't keep them at all.
The audio recording doesn't. There's no audio recording.
Sure.
It's real time back to the text, to the transcription, I call it, and it's there. That's kept for 20 visits
Fantastic.
in your local system only. So, contrary to most people experience, and you go back and log on another browser at home, it's not there because it's only on that local drive of that computer. So that's where their privacy policy to the European standards says it's okay because it meets the standards that network security. But the question is, do you need to record those transcriptions? Because, no, at the moment, after 20, they do go. And they made it 20 because some doctors complained they couldn't get the notes in, and they did it at the end of the day, so they let them have a chance to do it. But their policy was to delete all that. It was never kept. Yeah. And the only outcome is what you put into the PMS. So it's sort of like a pre-work.
It's sensible, right? I mean, because overwhelmingly the issue we see in our practice dealing with privacy concerns isn't that information's been deleted too quickly; it's been held on for too long. I mean, I don't know if people's experience is different, but typically the retention issues we see are too much being kept for an extended period of time. So, I mean, that's a great example of privacy by design, isn't it? Having that baked in from the very start. Something like ChatGPT and retention. I mean, and we've talked about this before. When you disclose it, you lose control of it. You've given it to them, right? So exactly. It's so that then builds into, should you have been providing it to them in the first place, where you actually have no control over their retention at all. And it's particularly acute when we're talking about these AI models, because there's every chance that actually they are going to use that information as part of the massive data set which is used to train the model. So their intention is to keep it in perpetuity. So again, look, it's probably the application of IPP9 retention, ensuring things aren't kept for longer than they should be, is really another shot across the bow in terms of making sure you're really careful about where your information is going in the first place.
Thank you for that. Really quickly, because I know we've talked about consents in part 1, can you just cover principles 10 and 11 and how that applies in terms of these broader AI programs?
Of course. So 10 and 11 deal with the circumstances in which you can use and disclose information. But broadly speaking, you can only use and disclose information for purposes which align with the purposes for which you originally gathered it. And again, it comes back to this concept of, well, what is this tool? Where is it sitting? What happens to the information that you provide to it? For the purposes of the Privacy Act, if you provide information to a third-party provider and they're effectively just using it on your instructions, they're doing exactly what you say and then they're providing it back to you, it's technically speaking not actually a disclosure. Legally, it stays with you. And that's just really to facilitate the way modern IT works. We do use a range of cloud services. If that was a disclosure every single time, it would make life really complicated. And something like NABLA, for example, information is largely stored locally, and they're not using it for their own purposes. So you don't have a disclosure. Where you need to be careful with these tools is where they are genuine cloud services, information is going off-site, and they are then actually using that for their own purposes. That's when you have a disclosure. If it's inconsistent for the purposes you gathered it for, presumably treating this patient, you might find yourself in a tricky situation. So again, it's about understanding what the tools do and where the information goes.
Thank you. So Principle 12 is really around when you send someone's information overseas, and we know that under this principle, the overseas agency must comply with New Zealand law. So how can we ensure that an overseas agency is complying with New Zealand law? To what lengths do we need to go to?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
and what does sending information mean?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? So are we sending information overseas? And again, it's that point. It's actually Section 11 of the Privacy Act for those who are interested. You're only really disclosing information to a third party when you're providing it to them and they are using it for their own purposes. So that's the first barrier we have to cross. And Carl, we've talked about this off mic. Technically, at what point is that actually happening? It's quite a complex issue. But let's say you are sending it to NABLA in France, and they have said, we're actually going to use this for improving our product, say. That's pretty common, right? How do you know that you're complying with IPP5, that you're providing the information to an entity that's going to comply with New Zealand law or laws that are comparable to New Zealand law? Look, it's really a case of jurisdiction, right? If you are providing it to a entity which is based in the EU, it's well acknowledged that EU data protection laws are at least as comparable as those in New Zealand. We actually have an adequacy decision from the EU at the moment that is them signing off on our privacy laws and saying we're happy with that, which is pretty much the gold standard. It's the best tick you can get. Look, there's other jurisdictions whereby you might be unsure about what the nature of the privacy and data protection regulation is like. And there it's really a case of ensuring the terms and conditions are appropriate. And we've talked about privacy impact assessments previously, but that's going to form part of that assessment. Is it appropriate for me to be sending it to this entity? Am I comfortable they're going to secure it? Am I comfortable they're not going to use it for another purpose? Are they going to delete it? And the PIA template that's on the Office of the Privacy Commissioner's website will just help you tick box that exercise, basically go through the various things. But it is difficult. It is difficult. I mean, the first thing is to look at the country it's going to. If it's a country with a modern privacy framework, you should be fine.
Okay.
And we're allowed to rely that if that company is in that country, that they're complying with their own, with their own local rules. If I've got a startup in a basement in Paris, I may be just doing my own thing, but if I'm offering a product and someone in New Zealand says, "Oh, they're in Paris, that's all right." Are we allowed to rely on them complying with their
question,
own?
Good question. The internet doesn't care about our little human country borders. The internet doesn't give a rat's about those things.
Well, we do.
But can we rely on it if we look at where they're coming from?
So I should say, looking at the jurisdiction you're coming from is a really good starting point, right? Like, Lucy, you're right to test me on that. You still do want to look at the terms and conditions, right? And you still probably do. If it is going to a third party provider of an AI tool, you still want to be conducting that privacy impact assessment. What I can say is that if you're sending it to Japan, you're probably going to find that assessment far easier than if you're sending it to some other jurisdictions that might not necessarily have such up-to-date frameworks. I can guarantee, and actually I know because I've looked at them, that the terms and conditions provided by some of these entities based out of the EU are actually very comprehensive and actually apply standards in privacy and data protection that are higher than we would require in New Zealand. So you're absolutely right. You can't just say, well, they're in Ghent, so I'm sure it's fine. But you're probably going to find that exercise a bit more straightforward.
I do worry about nefarious people out there, though, saying, I'm in Paris, here's my terms and conditions. We're doing everything right, and essentially a scam. And me sending data there, am I...
It's an interesting point, and it's a lacuna in our law, really, because there's other jurisdictions overseas whereby you don't just have to ensure these things are in place. We talked about IPv5 and security, and it says you need to ensure that when you disclose these things are in place. But the legislation, particularly the GDPR, explicitly states, and you need to be able to demonstrate that. You need to be able to document it. You need to be able to prove it if we ask you. So what did you do to test it? That doesn't exist in our legislative framework at present. Would the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, if you got in a sticky situation, say, well, how did you test? Maybe. We can't rule it out. But for the purposes of our legislation at the moment, there's nothing in there that actually requires you go out and say, show me on your screen.
So I can say, if they give me terms and conditions that make me think that they are in Paris and they are legitimate, even if they're not, I'm probably all right.
I think it's that reasonableness question, right? But I would go back to what I was saying before. If you go buy a car in New Zealand, you know it's gone through a whole lot of regulation. You go buy some food from the supermarket, you know it's regulated and checked. And same with buying any other item, some paint on your walls. With IT, you don't. Even if it comes from Paris, it's a different kind of independent assessment hasn't happened. So that's a generic rule, not just for AI. All IT doesn't have a regulating third party saying, do they do what they do? Like the council consenting your building request or a warrant of fitness checking the car independently from the car yard. So that's a buyer beware thing that applies for all IT.
And I would say as well, it's a deeply unlawyerly answer, but I do think there's an element of reputation bound up in all of this as well. If it's something like Copilot, which is a well-renowned piece of software and has loads of people using it and actually a good reputation, you can lean on that a bit, right? If if you are adopting something relatively shifty from one of the jurisdictions which is well known for producing things that are shifty, you're going to have a harder time convincing the Office of the Privacy Commissioner that you did your due diligence there. So I appreciate it's not a particularly forensic answer, but I think it's probably the reality of the situation we're dealing with.
Thanks, everybody. I'm sure we could talk about this for a lot longer. It's just a fascinating area and one that is very fast-paced. But I think we need to call a halt to our podcast. So thank you, Joe, Carl and Lucy, for sharing your expertise with us. And probably to take-home messages, I think, for our listeners would be that if you're going to use something that is narrow, such as the NABLA Copilot, the summarising programs, they are more well known, it's easier to control and safer to use. If you're going to use anything that involves generative AI or these large language models, then you need to have a great more deal of caution and do your homework. I think do your due diligence before you use it, and consider the Privacy Commissioner's privacy principles. I think that's very important because you can get unstuck very quickly. And that if you follow all of those things, including a privacy impact assessment, make sure you've got good, solid consent from patients about what you're doing, then you can proceed cautiously. Is there anything else anyone else would like to add?
I think in summary that privacy impact assessment is essential because we don't have third parties doing it. We do want to sort of group our resources and do one well, but that covers off the principles, right? So the privacy impact assessment is going through the principles in a thorough way.
Exactly. I suppose, you've hit it on the head there, Sam. I suppose the final thing is just the OPC has published guidance on this. It's 12 pages. It's pretty accessible. It's a good document to look at.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it's been helpful. We look forward to catching up with you in our next podcast. If you like the Medical Protection Podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. And if you would like a podcast on a specific topic, please email nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org.